New Mexico Territory, 1875, in the high desert country along the San Juan River, 7 years after the treaty that had let the Navajo people walk home from Bosque Redondo. And the land still carried the memory of that walk the way a body carries an old break in the bone, healed over, but never quite the same underneath. Caleb Hayes had inherited 1,100 acres of his father's ranch 2 years before, along with a drought that showed no sign of breaking, a herd cut nearly in half by 2 bad winters, and a debt at the Farmington Bank that grew a little heavier every season. He could not find the labor to work the place properly. He was 36 years old, unmarried, and increasingly certain that a man could not run a ranch of that size alone and expect to keep it. He had written to a matrimonial agency out of Denver in the fall, describing his circumstances plainly: a working ranch, a decent house, a hard climate, a need for a wife who would not flinch from labor. The agent, a smooth-talking man named Cyrus Wexford, who took his fee whether or not the marriage held, had written back within a month to say he had found precisely the match: a capable young woman, good with animals and accustomed to hard country, ready to travel by the first week of spring. What the agency's paperwork had not said, because Cyrus Wexford had learned through hard experience that saying it lost him clients, was that the woman in question was Den, Navajo, and that she had grown up on the reservation lands newly reestablished along the Chusca Mountains, the daughter of a family that had walked the long walk to Bosque Redondo as children and walked home again 4 years later, carrying nothing back with them but each other, and the things a person cannot be made to leave behind. Caleb Hayes stood at the wagon stop outside Farmington on a cold, clear morning in April, watching the freight wagon come down off the Mesa Road, expecting a stranger and expecting nothing else in particular. And when the wagon stopped and a young woman climbed down from the bed of it with a single trunk and a blanket rolled tight under one arm, he understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that the agency had not told him the whole truth. She was perhaps 22, straight-backed, dark-haired, with a face that held itself very still, the particular stillness of a person who has trained herself not to show what a moment costs her. She wore a traveling dress that did not fit her the way the dresses in Cyrus Wexford's letters had implied it should, and she stood beside the wagon with her chin level, waiting. "Mr. Hayes?" she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to keep it steady, though she did not let that show either. "That's me," Caleb said, and then he said nothing else at all, for a length of time that felt, to both of them, considerably longer than it actually was. The girl watched his face while he said nothing. She had ridden 3 days from Farmington's train connection, expecting exactly this: the silence, the recalculation happening behind a stranger's eyes, the moment where a man decided whether the woman standing in front of him was the one he had ordered or a mistake he intended to correct. "I know what you are seeing," she said, before he could find words of his own. "The agency did not tell you. I told them to tell you, and they did not, because they wanted their fee, and they believed you would not have written back if they had. I am not going to apologize for what I am, but I will tell you plainly, so there is no confusion between us. If you do not want this marriage, I will not force it on you, and I have money enough saved to get myself to my mother's hogan on the Chusca Road without troubling you for a cent of it. You need only say the word, and I will be gone before supper." Caleb Hayes looked at this woman who had just offered him, with more grace than he felt he deserved, the exact escape a lesser man might have reached for gratefully, and he found that the thing keeping him quiet was not what she thought it was. "I am not looking for the word," he said finally, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I am looking for your name." Nobody at that agency thought to send it to me plain, either. She studied him another moment, weighing whether the question was itself a kind of test she had failed to anticipate. Kayazi, she said, born to the Chiani, born for the Kinya-Ani. My mother's people and my father's people, if that means anything to you, which I do not expect it does. It means I asked, and you answered honest, Caleb said. That is the whole of what I know how to judge a person by. He loaded her trunk into his own wagon without further discussion, and they rode the 8 miles out to the ranch mostly in silence, though it was, Kai noted, a different silence than the one at the wagon stop had been, less a held breath, more a held door, open but not yet walked through. The ranch sat in a wide bend of a dry wash that ran water only after storms, a low adobe house with a shake roof added on by Caleb's father, a barn of cottonwood logs, and corrals holding perhaps 40 head of thin cattle and 6 horses that looked in considerably better condition than the cattle did, which told Kai something about the kind of rancher Caleb Hayes actually was, whatever the agency had failed to tell either of them about each other. House is small, Caleb said, showing her in. 1 room and a lean-to. I'll sleep in the barn. There's a bar for the door if you want it, and I'd take it as a kindness if you used it, not because I'd give you cause to need it, but because you ought to sleep easy knowing it's there, regardless of what you think of me by morning. Kai set her trunk down and looked around the small plain room, a stove, a table, a shelf, with perhaps a dozen books, a single window facing east toward the mountains she had grown up beneath. I have slept in worse rooms and trusted men less, she said. I will use the bar, not because I doubt you tonight, because a woman who has learned caution the way I have learned it does not set it down for one honest answer at a wagon stop. That is fair, Caleb said. I would think less of you if you did otherwise. She unrolled the blanket she had carried under her arm the whole 3 days of travel and spread it across the foot of the bed, a weaving in deep red and black and undyed white wool worked in a pattern of storm clouds and lightning that took up nearly the whole of the small room's remaining light when she shook it out. My grandmother wove this, she said, before he could ask, at Bosque Redondo, on a loom she built from scavenged wood in the 4th year of the walk they made her people take. She wove it to remember that her hands still knew how to make something beautiful, even in that place. She gave it to my mother, and my mother gave it to me, and I have carried it everywhere I have ever gone since I was old enough to understand what it cost to make. Caleb looked at the blanket a long moment, the storm pattern catching the last of the evening light through the window, and he did not say anything foolish about it, which Kai would come to understand, over the following weeks, was itself the most respectful thing a stranger had done for her in a very long time. The first months settled into a working rhythm neither of them had discussed, but both understood without needing to. Kai rose before dawn and had coffee going by the time Caleb came in from checking the herd, and within 2 weeks she had reorganized the kitchen garden, planted according to a dryland method her mother had taught her. Squash and beans and corn set together in the old way, each crop shading and feeding the others, using half the water Caleb's own attempts had ever managed. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, standing at the edge of the garden one evening, watching the young plants come up stronger than anything he had grown in 2 years of trying. My mother's mother taught her, on land not so different from this. Before the long walk took it from her for 4 years, my mother taught me. It is not a secret, Mr. Hayes. It is only knowledge nobody troubled to ask us for, before now. He began asking her a great many things after that. He asked about the sheep her family had once kept in numbers before the government had ordered most of the tribe's herds destroyed at Bosque Redondo to break their independence, a policy Kai described to him plainly and without flinching, the way a person describes a fact of weather rather than a wound still bleeding, though Caleb understood, watching her face while she said it, that it was both. He asked about the loom she began building in the lean-to from cottonwood poles and rawhide, replicating from memory the one her grandmother had built at Bosque Redondo, and he watched her weave in the evenings by lamplight, her hands moving with a certainty that nothing else in her life seemed to require of her, and he found himself, more evenings than not, simply sitting nearby to watch, not speaking, because speaking would have interrupted something he did not yet have words to name. By June, the blankets she had woven, 3 of them, in patterns her mother and grandmother had taught her, had been carried into Farmington by Caleb himself and sold to a trading post for more money than the ranch's entire spring cattle sale had brought in. You could sell 20 of these a year if you had the wool and the time, the trader told him, turning one of the blankets over in his hands with the particular reverence of a man who recognizes quality when it is placed in front of him. I have never seen work this fine come through Farmington. Caleb brought the money home and set it on the table in front of Kai without a word of claim on it. This is yours, he said. Every cent. I did not marry you to take your grandmother's skill and call it mine. Kai looked at the money, and then at him, for a long moment. Half, she said finally. For the wool, which came from your sheep, and the roof I wove it under, and because a marriage that keeps separate accounts is not much of a marriage at all. It was the closest either of them had come, in 3 months, to naming what had grown up quietly between them, and Caleb Hayes found that he did not have a single word ready to answer it. Only a feeling settling into his chest that he had not expected to feel again after 2 hard years of watching his father's ranch slip away from him one dry season at a time. Not every soul in Farmington shared the trader's admiration for Kai Yazzy's weaving, or for the marriage that had brought her to the San Juan Valley. Reverend Josiah Trent had come to Farmington 3 years before from a congregation back east, and he had built, in that time, a following among the town's more anxious families by preaching a steady diet of fear dressed up as scripture, fear of raids that had not occurred in years, fear of a peace with the Navajo people that he insisted was only ever temporary, fear that any softening toward the tribes newly returned to their homeland was an invitation to disaster. He had said nothing publicly about Caleb Hayes's marriage for the first several months, watching and waiting the way a man waits for public sentiment to ripen in his favor. By July, with the second summer of drought pressing hard on the whole valley and every rancher in the county looking for someone to blame for a season that would not turn, he judged the moment ready. He raised it from the pulpit on a Sunday in the last week of July, in front of the largest congregation Farmington's small church had drawn all year. There are those among us, Reverend Trent said, his voice carrying to the back pews, who have brought a stranger into their homes and called it Christian charity, when Scripture itself warns against being unequally yoked. I speak of no one man in particular. He looked directly at the pew where Caleb sat, 3 rows back, alone, because Kai had not come to town that Sunday. But I would ask this congregation to consider what it means for our daughters and our herds both to welcome into intimate trust a people whose loyalty this territory has had cause to question within living memory. I do not say this from hatred. I say it from care for this community's safety. The congregation murmured. Some of it was agreement. Some of it, Caleb noted with a measure of relief, was clearly discomfort at hearing it said so plainly from the pulpit. Caleb Hayes stood up in the middle of the sermon, which was not a thing done in that church, and every head turned. My wife's grandmother walked 300 miles at gunpoint to a camp this territory built to starve her people into submission, and she walked 300 miles back 4 years later because the government finally admitted the whole policy had been a cruelty and a failure, Caleb said, his voice unsteady with an anger he had not fully known he was carrying until it found its way out of him. She did not raid anybody, Reverend. She wove a blanket in that camp to prove to herself she was still a person, and she raised a daughter who raised my wife to do the same. If loyalty is the question, I would ask this congregation which side of that history earned it, and which side is still asking for the benefit of the doubt 7 years later. He walked out of the church before the Reverend could answer him, and the walking out cost him plainly. In the weeks that followed, 2 ranchers who had always traded fairly with him began finding reasons not to. The bank's manager grew suddenly less patient about the note on Caleb's land, and more than one family that had once waved at him on the road now looked the other way. Kai heard the whole account from him that evening, sitting across the small table from each other in the lamplight, and she reached over and set her hand over his, the way she had never quite let herself do before that day. "You did not have to say any of that," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "I said it anyway." The Reverend's second move came 3 weeks later, and it came at night, and it came with rope and torches and the particular cowardice of men who only find their courage in a crowd and in the dark. Kai heard the horses first, a dozen or more, coming up the wash road well past midnight, and she woke Caleb with a hand on his shoulder before the first shout reached the house. "Hayes!" A voice called from beyond the corral fence, distorted with drink, and with the specific meanness that drink brings out in men who already believed themselves justified. "We've come to see the squaw off this land before she brings the whole tribe down on this valley. You've got 10 minutes to put her on a horse, or we'll put the torch to the barn and let the fire decide it for you." Caleb reached for his rifle. Kai reached for something else entirely. "Wait," she said. "If you go out that door with a gun, this becomes exactly the story Reverend Trent has been telling all summer, that we are dangerous, that violence follows us." I know a better way to answer him. She lit the lamp instead of dousing it, so the men outside could see plainly into the house, and she stood in the doorway where every one of them could see her face clearly, and she spoke to them in a voice that did not shake, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "My name is Kai Yazi," she said. "I am Din, of the Cheyenne, born for the Kenya Ani, and I am the lawful wife of Caleb Hayes under the laws of this territory, married by a licensed minister in Farmington in April of this year, with the papers to prove it filed at the county recorder's office. The Treaty of 1868 recognizes my people's right to live on our own land in peace. It says nothing about forbidding a woman from marrying whom she chooses, and no man in this territory has the legal authority to remove me from my own home by torchlight. If you burn this barn tonight, you will not be defending this valley from anything. You will be committing arson and attempted assault against a citizen, and I promise you every one of you will be named to the marshal by morning, because I have already recognized 3 horses and 2 voices among you, and I do not forget a face easily." There was a long, uncertain silence beyond the fence. "She's bluffing," one of the riders said, though his own voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Try me," Kai said, "and find out by daylight whether I am." It was Caleb who broke the standoff, stepping into the doorway beside her with his rifle held low but visible, not raised, not threatening, only present. "Reverend Trent sent you," he said, "and Reverend Trent is at home in his own bed right now, warm and safe, while you men freeze out here doing the dangerous work he was too much of a coward to do himself." Ask yourselves whose courage this actually is before you burn down a neighbor's barn over it. The riders held a moment longer, and then, one by one, without further words, they turned their horses and rode back down the wash road the way they had come, leaving the night quiet again except for the settling creak of the corral fence and the sound of Kai's breath finally, slowly, coming even. She did not cry until they were gone. Then she cried for perhaps a minute, standing in the doorway with Caleb's arm around her shoulders, and then she stopped, because there was still work to be done, and she had never in her life let fear finish a task that courage had started. The marshal rode out from Farmington 2 days later, summoned by Caleb's own account and confirmed by 3 of Kai's neighbors, den families along the wash, who had seen the riders pass in the night and recognized enough of them to name names of their own. Reverend Josiah Trent denied having ordered any such action, and there was no paper proving otherwise, but the 2 ranchers Kai had named as riders were charged with attempted arson before the territorial court, and the congregation that had once filled Farmington's church 3 rows deep began, over the following months, to thin considerably, as more families than not found they preferred a Sunday morning without quite so much fear preached at them. Trent left the territory before the following spring, his congregation having dwindled past the point of a living wage, and nobody in Farmington troubled themselves overly much to wish him well on his way out. The drought broke that autumn, a full week of hard rain that filled the wash for the first time in 2 years and brought the grass back green across the whole valley, and Caleb Hayes's herd, helped along by the money from Kai's weaving, and by a season finally willing to cooperate, began to recover in a way that made the Farmington Bank considerably more patient about the remaining note. They built a proper loom room onto the side of the house that winter, with good north light and enough space for 2 looms working side by side, because Kai had begun teaching 2 of her younger cousins from the reservation the patterns her grandmother had carried out of Bosque Redondo, and the trading post in Farmington had taken to reserving space on its shelves specifically for what it now called, with some pride, Hayes Weaving. A year to the month after she had stepped off that freight wagon braced to be sent away, Kai Yazzie Hayes stood in the doorway of a house that had become entirely her own, watching her husband come in from a herd grown strong again across grass grown green again, and she thought about the silence that had greeted her at the wagon stop that first cold morning, the silence that had terrified her because she had spent a lifetime learning what silence from a stranger usually meant. She understood now, a year on, exactly what that silence had actually been. It had not been the sound of a man deciding whether to send her away. It had been the sound of a man discovering, in the space of 4 unguarded seconds, that the thing standing in front of him was not a mistake the agency had made, but the one true correction his whole hard life had been quietly waiting for. The blanket her grandmother had woven at Bosque Redondo still lay across the foot of their bed, its storm pattern a little more faded now with a year of use, and beside it, on the wall of the loom room, hung the first blanket Kai had woven since her wedding, a pattern of her own devising, not her grandmother's storm clouds, but something new, mountains and a river, and worked small into one corner where only a person who knew to look would find it. 2 figures standing together in a doorway, neither one of them looking away. Some silences carry rejection in them, and a person learns, from hard experience, to brace against that kind before it lands. But some silences carry the opposite, the sound of a heart recalculating everything it thought it knew, and finding, in that recalculation, not a problem to be solved, but a life it had not known to hope for. Kai Yazzie had spent 3 days of travel bracing for the first kind of silence. What she found instead on a cold April morning at a wagon stop outside Farmington was the second kind, and she had spent every day since learning to trust it. She stepped off that wagon ready to be sent back. His silence scared her most, until she understood it had never once been about sending her anywhere at all. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet and took the long road and stayed long enough to change everything, then this story was for you. Out along the San Juan River, where the mountains still hold the memory of a walk no one should have had to take, the love between Caleb Hayes and Kai Yazzie became the kind that answered an old cruelty, not with more silence, but with a home built loud and lasting enough to be seen from every ridge around it. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, prejudice, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to you, follow the Lonesome Trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.